Okay, good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome to this webinar hosted by BH Consulting about the ISO 27001 Information Security Standard. My name is Gordon Smith. I'm a writer and journalist, and I've covered cybersecurity and data protection going back almost 20 years. I'll be your host for today's event, and I'll be introducing our guest speaker very shortly. Just to say, to set the context, when we were planning the event earlier this year, we weren't to know here in late May that Ireland's health service was going to be in the grip of a large-scale ransomware attack. One of the outcomes of that has been that cybersecurity has been dominating the headlines for almost 2 weeks now. In all my years covering this industry, I don't think security has ever had this level of prominence and profile. And it's not hard to imagine that boards, management, and directors everywhere are asking themselves how they can protect their organizations against threats like this. So security is very definitely near the top of the agenda, as it's never been before, and it makes today's event even more relevant and timely. So with that, let's look at the agenda and what's planned for the coming hour. So we are going to look at what ISO 27001 certification covers, how companies can define the scope of what is involved in getting certified, and how can they maybe reasonably limit that to their own resources. And we'll also look at actually what's involved in getting certified and the process you need to go through. We'll also cover how BH Consulting helps its own customers with their certification and the particular process that BH Consulting uses. Then we're going to look at maintaining certification, because as you'll discover, this isn't a once and done exercise, it's an ongoing effort. We'll also look at areas such as ISO 27701 and how you go about getting that. That particularly relates to privacy, as we'll hear. Now, here to tell us through all of this is a very experienced person. We've got David Prendergast, Senior Security and Compliance Consultant with BH Consulting. David is a former CISO. He's held security and operational risk roles in financial services, technology, manufacturing, health, and local government organizations. So really spanning the full industry spectrum. And in particular, Dave is a very experienced practitioner in ISO 27001, has worked with many organizations ever since, in fact, the standard was originally known by its first name, BS 7799. So here to tell us what's involved in the certification, let's start. David, if you can tell us a little bit more about what is ISO 27001 and what's involved in it.
Sure, thanks very much for the introduction, Gordon. As Gordon says, I'm David Prendergast. That was a pre-COVID picture of me, so in a suit, which I haven't worn for over a year, so I'm praying it still fits. It's a pre-COVID haircut as well, actually, obviously. I'm originally from the northeast of England, but now firmly settled here in Ireland, living in County Laois. So I'm trying to get them all to speak properly here in the Midlands. I've been with BH Consulting for 3 years now, but before that I worked in various banks here in Ireland, and previously worked with IBM up at the campus in Dublin 15. And before that, I worked with Guinness when they still had their brewery back in London. Before that, I worked with manufacturing companies, with councils, in health authorities directly myself. As Gordon said, I've got a long checkered history. I've been doing security for a long time, and IT support before that. Working with ISO itself for well over 20 of those years, with clients large and small, and helping them with their certifications. As Gordon said, both as an employee, sitting on your side of the desk, essentially, the other side from the auditor, and latterly helping companies with their certification. So when we help you with your certification, I'm hoping to bring that practicality side, the things that you will find useful to get you through that certification. So the certification itself, it's a globally accepted standard. Many of you be familiar with it, some of you might not be. The key thing about it is it provides that external validation. So the standard itself, it's scalable to any size organization. And I've worked personally with sole traders, with 2 and 3 people companies, right up to multinationals. And both the standard and the audit process include the people, processes, and the technology involved in maintaining security within your organization. So it's not just about IT, and it's not a guarantee against data breaches.
Okay, and David, so where do you start? What's involved in starting on the road then to becoming certified? And maybe you might tell us a little bit about what's driving people towards becoming certified to ISO 27001.
Sure. If you're thinking of going down the certification path, I'd very much encourage you to do that. I'm a big advocate of the standard, having worked with it so long, and because it's so flexible and applicable to any organization. But it's how it adds value to your organization. You should really understand it's a long-term commitment and an investment. It's not just a badge to impress people. It is something you have to, there's a strong element around continuous improvement with regular periodic checks and audits. As I said before, it's not an insurance policy against breaches, but what it does mean, it means you're prepared for, you have a good, strong incident response process, and you should have business continuity plans in place to better deal with anything if it should happen to you. And as a lot of the stats tell you, it's a case of when, not if, you'll be attacked or breached as well. So the certification itself demonstrates a clear commitment. It's the key thing is it demonstrates a clear commitment to security management, to your third parties, to your clients, to your stakeholders. And we've all seen those statements after a breach, right? We take your security seriously. Well, getting certification actually demonstrates in practice that you do. It provides a framework. So somebody's thought about this stuff beforehand. It's a framework to ensure the fulfillment of commercial, contractual, and legal responsibilities. It makes sure that you have a process in place to identify and manage your risk exposure, which is different depending on the company you are, and it builds or enhances that security culture in your organization. It can provide a potentially significant competitive advantage and can effectively be a license to trade in some regulated sectors. So some industries require certification to even allow you to submit a tender for work. We're seeing this more and more, that you've got to be certified before you'll even accept a tender. And the key thing, as I said, is it provides that external validation of the security systems, people, process, technology in place across your organization. I actually believe GDPR, which I've seen in the press this week, it's now 5 years old since it was initiated, almost 3 years since it's actually been enacted, since it became law. I believe that's driven a lot of companies towards ISO certification because big organizations, particularly themselves, have had to take a deeper look, not just into their own security controls, but the controls of their third parties, their supply chain. And if you think about that for a minute, if you spend a lot of time and effort and money on security, the security of your own business and the information you store and process, why would you then pass that on to another company who doesn't take care of it?
Actually, you raise a really interesting point there, David, and it's really linked to the theme that we chose for today's event, which is about building trust in your business. And when you talk about some of the certification benefits, reducing the chances of breaches are an obvious one, but even minimization of risks, but also showing in an externally validated way that you take those threats seriously. Can you tell me a little bit in more detail about some of those benefits and how they relate to how your organization is perceived by the outside world?
Sure. So one of the things you have to do is early on is define the scope. So you develop a scope statement for where you are going to be certified for. So the scope defines where and what exactly the ISMS, the Information Security Management System, and I'll talk about that shortly, what that's applicable to. So you can define the scope a number of different ways. You can actually look to certify a location, you can certify a system or a specific process. The organization should also consider the activities which impact on the ISMS or the activities that you outsource, either to other parts within your organization. So if another part of your business does something for you, if you have a different part of the company that does your IT for you, or to independent suppliers and indeed cloud providers too. So for your particular scope, what are you looking for? Why are you looking for certification? So if you've got a product that clients are using, they want to know that that product and all the processes and infrastructure and people that support it are secure. So that's most likely going to be your scope focused around that. If you manage a data center to house client data, the scope would cover everything in place around those premises, including the people, processes, and technology for that site. Your access controls, who can come and go. Physical controls will be a big element. So your scope statement is essentially your public declaration on where you focus your efforts of security.
And it sounds like what you're saying there, David, is that you don't necessarily need to apply all the controls of ISO 27001 everywhere. You can kind of take an a la carte approach just before we get into that structure.
To some degree. So the section, the standard itself, as I mentioned before, it refers to an information security management system. So that describes the controls an organization needs to implement to make sure it's sensibly managing the identified risks. It's all around risk management. The standard itself is essentially split into two parts. The first part, this is mandatory. So all these bits on here are mandatory. It's clauses 1 to 10. It's commonly known as clauses 4 to 10. The first 3 are like admin type stuff, documentation. So this is the first part of it, clauses 4 to 10. And this is where you've got to demonstrate that your leadership in the company has a commitment to security and risk management. Not just saying, oh yeah, that's good, we'll pay for it, that's fine. That's not enough of a commitment. So you've got to have the right organizational structure in place to inform your management about key IT and security related risks. Are you identifying risks, and are you passing those risks up so that senior management can actually make business decisions on them? You've got to have policy. There's a lot focus on policies. You've got to have policies. Policies are essentially your company statement on your expectations of your staff. The broadly speaking, do good stuff, don't do bad stuff, but you have to explain what you mean by good and what you mean by bad. And you've got to have objectives that are clear as well and easily understood by your staff. You've also got to have adequate and suitably trained resources made available. So, you know, it's no good just giving security to the kid who's in from college for 2 weeks in the summer. You've got to make that commitment. And you've got to be able to communicate the importance of having those good security controls. And I mentioned the senior management commitment. You've got to make sure the right level of resources are in place for your size of organization. So if you're a multinational and you've only got 2 people doing IT and security, that's probably enough. And as we've seen in other areas, there can be dire consequences if you don't have the right resources in place. The second part of the standard is the one people are more familiar with. This is called Annex A, which includes all of the different sections, each with its own set of controls. So I'll just pick a couple of those for example. So human resources security. You've got most companies, so smaller companies might not, but somebody's responsible for HR for your recruitment type of side of the house. So in ISO 27001, this looks at the security elements before, during, and after employment, or when somebody's about to leave. So during the recruitment phase, the standard looks for what your company's process, what your processes are for getting references and background checks for prospective employees. Now, the standard's not prescriptive. It doesn't say you must get 2 references, you must get these checks, because it actually differs hugely on, depending on the role in the company you're working for, the organization, the industry you're in. So if you're dealing with finances, you might want to get very diligent checks from previous employees. You might do financial background checks to make sure somebody doesn't have huge debts or gambling debts or something like that. If you're working, we all know that if you're working with kids or you know, certain types, certain adults, vulnerable adults, you've got to get Garda vetting or some kind of police background checks. So it's just asking you, the standard ISO 27001 is saying, what are the right background checks for you in your organization? If you're in manufacturing, you might not need that level of detail for a background check. So you have to define what's right for your company. Then it moves on to look for the during employment phase. So it's looking at security awareness and training. What are you providing for your staff? How are you keeping them up to date with threats? I mean, these days, as you mentioned, you can just pick up a newspaper and see what the threats are. But pertinent to your organization, how are you keeping people up to date? And do they know what to do if they encounter a problem? Who are you going to call? It's not Ghostbusters. And if somebody is about to leave, people leave for a variety of different reasons. Some leave on good terms, some leave on bad terms. What are the processes you have in place to deal with that? How do you make sure all your assets get returned? Do you need to switch them off the day they hand their notice in, or are you happy for them to wait and work their notice out and then switch off their access? And do you make sure that that access is actually switched off? So some of that feeds into the access control section. There's another section there I'll just cover briefly on compliance, for example. That looks at how you keep up to date with legal and regulatory requirements, the legs and regs. And obviously these differ if you're doing business in other countries outside the EU. There's actually a supporting document called ISO 27002, which provides additional details for each of the controls in the annexes. So it lists out all the things you could do. You don't have to do, but you could do to meet the requirements. And you might not need to do all of them, but it's like a good cheat sheet, a good checklist to say, if you do all of these or do some of these relevant to your business, then that will meet the requirements of the standard.
And that sounds like a really good point to hammer home as well, because as you've said, the standard itself isn't prescriptive, but they have published annexes. So you do get a sense of, well, here are some really useful things that you can do that will get you up to the level of being eligible to be certified. Is that fair to say that they do help you along the way? It's not simply that you have to feel your way yourself or get guidance as to what you're ultimately going to need to do to get certified.
They do, but they're not the easiest documents in the world to read, to be honest. So that's where we try and add that bit of value and try and decipher them to tell you exactly what the requirements are, what they're looking for, and importantly, what an auditor is going to look for when they come looking for that information.
Absolutely, and that's a critical point we'll come back to about the auditor. So we mentioned at the start that we covered what's involved in getting certified. Can you talk us through the 4-stage process that BH Consulting uses?
Sure. We always recommend that clients start out with the gap analysis. This is, as it says, it's a gap analysis. It says, here are the 114 controls in the standard itself, the annexes, and where do you stand against those 414 controls? Would you pass an audit today, or are there any gaps in it? But what we try and do is we don't just identify with the gaps, we try and talk you through the process of what's required to fill those gaps. We produce a report at the end as well, but you learn that certainly when we're doing gap analysis, the intention is that you learn as part of that process what I expect to see when I come back and audit you. If it's me auditing, that what I'm going to look for, what would satisfy that requirement. So it's actually a gap analysis with some addition. It's a training exercise at the same time. So we go through each section of the standard. We then do a risk assessment, which is kind of a standalone exercise, but you're required to do risk assessments. It's a comprehensive risk assessment process, but we've got a methodology that comes with it. If you have your own, we can use that instead. But if you don't, we'll bring a methodology for you, which serves as a piece of evidence in its own right for the standard. It's fairly straightforward. It's not radical thinking, but it's based on other ISO standards. And we develop a risk register during that workshop, and we look at physical assets. You might already have some lists of IT assets. If you haven't, start developing them, because you will need them. Whether you go for certification or not, it's good to know what devices you have connected to your network. So we look at all the IT assets, the physical stuff, from buildings down to equipment you might have in the office or around your workspaces, to other key things. Some clients would have labs and have very critical assets that they'd find hard to replace. And of course, your lists of laptops and mobile devices, all those kind of things. We also look at logical risks. So the risks around user access, the risks around availability, the risks around all those sort of logical things, risks to your website, risks around social media, and we look at service risks. So your suppliers, the suppliers you rely on, some of them you take for granted. Electricity, internet. Can you operate without internet? A lot of companies can't these days. Water. So you might get that as part of the office you're renting, but if you don't have it, does that actually shut your business down? Because if you haven't got water supplied to the office, you've got no sanitation, no drinking water, you might have no air conditioning. So how does that impact your business? And the follow-up to that is, of course, do you have contingency? Do you have resilience in place? And if you do, that's good. And if you don't, it identifies gaps. What happens if somebody stops paying the bill? Do they shut off the electric? Does that actually impact your business? So again, we're looking to make sure you have the right controls in place, to contingency measures to make sure that these risks don't transpire. They don't actually cause damage to your business. That's a risk assessment phase. We then do a big chunk of work, which is the alignment. Now, this is making sure that you have the right documents in place. or at least are aware of what's required. So assessing each of the clauses in the standard relevant to your ISMS, which ones apply to you, which ones don't. That's a document I'll talk about in a second. So we help you define the scope and other requirements. You might have your own policies. We might review those, or we can provide policies that are specific to your organization if that's required. You need to understand how to treat risks. So once we've identified risks, what are we going to do with them? How are we going to process them? How are we going to deal with those risks to actually bring the risk down? We want to try and reduce the risk. You might transfer it, you might get an insurance policy, but there's different ways of treating the risk. And what we do at this phase, and it's a document I put a lot of faith in, there's a requirement to have what's called an SOA, a Statement of Applicability. Now, the requirement and standard is very basic. You list out the 114 controls and you say, this one applies to us, yes, 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 yes. This one doesn't, and here's why it doesn't. But what we try and do is expand this document so that it becomes a key document that you can build on, build your evidence towards, and it actually makes you more confident when you're conducting an audit because you've got all your work prepared. Any question the auditor's going to ask you, so can you ask me about this clause? Yep, I've got it here, and here's where my evidence is. And you can build up that stock. It improves your confidence, and it shows the auditor that you're already organized and prepared. You know what the requirements are, you know where they are, and you've got them filed somewhere too. Now, they might find some gaps in it, and that's fine, and that's normal audit practice. That's what we do during that phase. Sorry.
And just before we get to that, that's an interesting point. Will the auditors only ever be asking you questions against those 114 controls, or is it as kind of prescriptive as that, or do they have a bit of a license to go off script and check you against other policies and controls you may or may not have?
Auditors think they have a license to go anywhere. But so it depends. It depends on the audit process that they're following, and actually the implementation phase, the final phase that we would do, is the bit about preparing you for that audit process. We might actually conduct an internal audit for you. You can do it yourself, or you can get another company to do it for you, an external company to do an internal audit for you. But we do that for you to make sure that you've identified all those gaps before the accreditation body does. So. You're then ready for the audit process itself, and I'll answer your question in just a moment. So the external audit, which we can't do, it has to be an accredited body. Okay, there's each country has its own accredited list of companies that are allowed to do this, that are authorized to do these type of audits. So I tend to refer to the audit process, the certification process. It's a bit like junior cert, leaving cert for the Irish clients to understand that, certainly. If not, it's your mocks, maybe in your final exam. So stage one assessment is your junior cert, and that determines if the mandatory requirements, remember those clauses 4 to 10, if they're being met, or if your management system is ready to go to stage 2. Okay, so have you read what's required? Do you know what's expected? And there's some elements of the annexes as well, just to make sure you've got some of the basics in place. You know what's ready, you know what's required of you, and you're looking good for the stage 2. Anything identified as a non-conformity, they call it NC1s, NC2s, major non-conformity, minor non-conformity. You have to be addressed by the time this stage 2 comes around. There's usually a gap between 2 or 3 months between stage 1 and stage 2. Not always, but there usually is. That's to allow you time to resolve any issues identified in stage 1. Also to build up evidence. You don't have to have everything squeaky clean by stage 2. You don't have to have everything fixed on the day of an audit. Remember, I said before, it's about continuous process. So as long as you've identified a risk, if you've identified that you have your firewall isn't being maintained, you need to fix that straight away. If I've identified as a risk that you don't have adequate controls around your mobile devices, you might decide to implement a mobile device management solution. That could take months. It could take weeks or months to decide the right product, to test it out, to make sure it's right and right for you. So I don't want you to fix that in 2 weeks. I want you to do it properly and follow all the right processes. So some of these things don't have to be fixed on the day of the audit, as long as you know there's a risk and you're addressing that risk. Okay. Stage 2.
Sorry, Dave, just
go on, please.
And just to remind the audience, by the way, we're hoping to have some time at the end of the session for some questions and answers. So I can see there's 1 or 2 questions already in there. If I can remind you to drop the questions and answers into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll look to answer as many of those as possible before we wrap up. So David, sorry to cut across you, please continue.
It's fine, as long as they're not above this strange Leach accent I'm developing anyway. That's fine. So then you come to your stage 2 audit, your leaving cert. This determines the effectiveness. So this is a lot more in-depth. This goes through all of the controls to make sure that you're confirmed that your management system, your information security management system controls have been implemented and they're fully operational. So this isn't just that your policies have been signed. This is actually that you're doing what it says in the policies, okay? This is where an auditor can deep dive a bit more and go off track and ask you about the process behind things. They can, back in the days when we used to be allowed in the office, they can actually approach members of staff and say, are you aware of these policies? Do you know what to do? Do you know who to call if you have a security incident? And if they don't know the answer, then obviously your incident response process and your training and awareness isn't picking that up. So it's, you might have agreed it, but it's not effective, okay?
Yeah.
So they would then determine whether you're actually applying what you said you were going to do in the policy, okay? Once they're happy that you've got all, you do meet the requirements. And as I said, you might get 1 or 2 minor non-conformities, as long as there's not a whole batch of them. If there's I don't know if there's an actual number to say that you can't, you don't qualify, but if they're confident that there's a small number of non-conformities that you can address, they would then send off for certification decision. They might actually wait until you've addressed some of the non-conformities and then send off for that decision. But usually the clients that we would tend to work with would have a small number of non-conformities, if any at all, and they'd say, right, we're going off at this point, saying, off you go to get certified. There's a validation check made on that certification decision just to make sure that the auditing's been done in the correct way. And on successful completion, you get your certification and some rules around how you can advertise and publicize that. As I said previously, the ISO certification is a commitment. So you have to conduct internal audits at least annually. You can do them in-house if you have trained people to do that, or a consultancy firm like ourselves can do that for you. But it's around ensuring that continuous improvement. You're identifying risks, you're figuring out what to do with them, and you're resolving them over a period of time.
And to that point, how do you maintain certification? And maybe can we look a little bit at some of the evidence that you're going to need when the time comes to be audited? So
there's a number of different items you can record or reference as evidence during the audit process. So I'll just take an example. You might have a suite of policies that state that you have to have a suite of policies. You have to have some policies there that state the company's expectations and rules. You can have 1 policy, you can have 15 policies. It's not prescriptive, but they expect to have all of the controls or the core of the controls covered in your policies, because it's a company directive to say, this is what we expect from you when you're using our systems. But your policy, you might have a password policy, for example, that says you use, I don't know, 8 or 12 characters and you have multiple complexity on them. Now, if your IT guy, your IT support guy, or your team of IT support are available on the day, you can get them to show the audit and walk through your policy. Your written policy says this complexity, and look at my Active Directory, look at my cloud system. Here's where that setting has been applied in my IT application. But if they're not available, or actually if to keep them busy working, you can get them to produce a screenshot for you for each of the different core systems you've got. Because a screenshot's got a date and time on the bottom as well, a date stamp. So if it's within the last couple of weeks or the last couple of months even, it's still relevant and applicable. It shows you've got a policy and how you've applied it. So there's a lot of different ways you can build evidence without having 20 people on the call. You can actually pre-prepare. And that's what I'd work you through with the statement of applicability, to make sure all those bits of evidence are there in advance. It also improves your relaxation and comfort factor if you ever relaxed in front of an auditor, but you're more prepared because you've got this pre-prepared. You're not waiting for somebody else and hoping their connectivity's there. You've got your evidence in advance. There's a whole host of other documents that serve as evidence. Agendas, agenda of meetings, meeting minutes, to show that you told the senior management team about these risks and they made some decisions and got some action items out of it. So those are pieces of evidence, for example. During our 4-stage process, as I said, we make sure you know what evidence is required, and we'll help you through building up that evidence bank for your audits.
Yeah, and looping back to the point you made earlier, where you said that this does help with documenting your processes. Clearly, as you've mentioned just there, you want to have records of minutes of meetings and that kind of thing. So what you don't want is a company that's kind of agreeing things over a coffee in the canteen. It's all minuted, documented. That speaks towards a certain process and a repeatable way of doing things.
From the day we're talking to you, you're building evidence. So you're starting, having a gap analysis, having a report from that gap analysis is a piece of evidence. Your risk assessment and the risk register we develop, they're pieces of evidence. It's formalizing things. As I said on the slide there, if the old auditor's adage, it's not absolutely true, but from an auditor's perspective, if you haven't documented it, it's not done. So what you're doing is building that evidence bank to say that, look, we know what the requirements are of the standard. Here's where we've got it covered by policy. Here's our company statement on our commitment to it. And look, we're actually doing it. That's all your evidence really is. So training and awareness, for example, you can keep evidence. You've got formal training that you might do from an online e-learning platform, but you don't have to buy that. If you want to invest in those things, they're good. There's some really good new ones on the market. But every time you send an email out to tell people, look out for this threat, beware of this, look out for these things coming on email, or a team huddle, just record those huddles or team meetings that you're having and where you're covering security elements. Every time you send an email out with a topic, or you put something on your intranet site, that's awareness, and you're bringing people up to make sure that they're careful what they're clicking on, they're watching out for mails coming in, they're careful on the websites that they're interacting with.
Do you have any thoughts on where that evidence should reside while companies are in the process of gathering it and putting it? Is there a recommended best practice as to what you should do with that evidence?
So we use the statement of applicability, or what we recommend people to do is build that into your statement of applicability, and it will depend on the evidence, because if it's a pen test, for example, a network penetration test report might have some very technical details that you might not want to put that on a share, not a public share, but a share within the organization. So if it's something like that, you have to be careful about where you're storing that. If it's a policy document, everybody in the company should have seen it anyway. So probably, unless it's an IT specific one, if it's something very detailed, again, it might be very specific to IT. So you have to be careful where you're storing it. But from an audit perspective, I want to see that it's there, that it's applied. So again, you can screenshot a policy to show that it's there without actually having the contents of the policy. You could show that it's there and it's not applicable for everyone. So you do have to, during that audit process, I want to see the evidence enough to satisfy me that you have company expectations and you're actually applying it for real, okay?
This seems like an obvious place to jump in with the questions very pertinent to how we've all been working over the past year, which is whether these kinds of audits can take place remotely, and is it possible to get, to work towards aiming to become certified entirely remotely, or does it need to be done on site?
It's a great question. It certainly provided some challenges around some particular sections. So physical security, I know that the auditing companies, the external accreditation bodies were particularly concerned about how they could certify somebody without being able to physically walk around their premises. And I know that we're considering walking around with video cameras and stuff like that. What our role is to get you ready for certification. So even those areas like physical security, I can tell you what I expect to see and what I'm going to come and audit you for. So if you do have a server room, an IT room that has to have air conditioning units in it, I can tell you all the controls I want to see around that. Is it serviced? Is it maintained? What do you have monitors or sensors in the place? We all have fire alarms in the building, we would hope, because it's the law. So I want to see where your fire alarms are. Do you have the right fire suppressants, particularly around an IT room? So I'm going to prepare you for that and make sure you have those things in place. You don't need an auditor on site. You could go around and photograph them. Great shot. take some shots, show me your contract that you have when it was last maintained. Show me the contract you have with the maintenance company who supplies it, maintains and looks after it. Show me the last time you did a fire drill. They're great controls around physical security and environmental controls to show that you're looking after your environment, because if they break or go wrong, your IT system could be impacted. Okay, that's what those protections are there for. So it's certainly been challenging. It's certainly been different. As I said, I've been encouraging people to take photographs rather than walking you around the place, or screenshots rather than physically showing a document. We've had some cases where the Zoom or the Teams call is broken down. Great, you can send me those screenshots afterwards. As long as I'm convinced that you have the evidence in place and you are applying it, I'm happy. So, and so far so good. We've had pretty good record throughout the pandemic, certainly with people who have gone for certification. We've had no major hiccups that I can think of where it's caused us an issue. So absolutely, it's something. Our job is to get you ready and prepared, so you're fully confident going into those audits. We can join you in the audits as well if you need us to, but really, your company, an external accreditation audit will want to check how you manage your risks, not how BH Consulting helps you with them. It's how you're managing them internally yourself once we've gone home and we're doing our thing. Okay,
that's an important distinction. Let's take a look now, before we jump to the Q&A, at some of the extensions, the more recent extensions to the ISO 27001 standard. Can you talk us through some of the more recent developments in that space?
Sure. So there are some additional specific standards in the 27,000 family. There's an awful lot, actually, some of them still in development. It takes a long time to get something into to signed off to be an actual standard. So lots of them are draft documents and they're working through. We're actually involved with the NSAI in the committees that determine these, that sort of set them right for before they get into production world out in the wild. So we've got things like 27,017, 27017, that looks at security controls for cloud computing. 2718 looks at the personally identifiable information, PII information, in public clouds. So how you're controlling and managing that in a public cloud environment. There's others like they're very specific, very targeted. 2731 looks at ICT resilience and recovery around business continuity. Another one, 27,400, which I think is still in draft stage. It's around the security and privacy of the Internet of Things. Where you've got IT stuff collecting information, your fridges and your cookers and all those sort of things with an IT chip in it, and how you're going to keep those patched. One of the more recently approved standards, the one we're going to talk about now, is 27701. This is a certification scheme for your privacy information management system, or PIMS. So it's not a solution for GDPR, but GDPR could be one of the privacy regulations that it helps you with in terms of compliance. So, for example, I'll give a few examples. I talked through some of these before, where ISO 27001 looks at the controls for backing up data. You should back up your data, especially at the moment, where we've got ransomware that's rampant across the world. Do focus on your backing up data. Make sure you don't just back up the data that you've tested, that it's away from your production environment. So if you do get infected, that your backups are still safe and you can use them for recovery. Test out that recovery process. That's what you have to do as part of 27001. That's what we look to make sure you have those processes in place. 27701 specifically looks at the requirements of backup and recovery and restoration of PII, personally identifiable information, and any further requirements around erasure of PII that might come about, and how that might impact your backups. We talked before about HR security controls, about the process of pre, during, and after employment. So 27701 additionally checks that training and awareness, for example, includes incident reporting in the context of possible personal data breaches. So it's not just a security breach, it's a personal data breach. What do you have to do for a personal data breach? We also talked about the requirements for compliance. So again, in 27701, the organization should identify any potential legal sanctions related to the processing of PII in other jurisdictions. So if you are working in a global context or in other countries, including the UK, the Brexit, what are the legal implications for operating and storing or processing PII data, personally identifiable information data, in those jurisdictions?
Okay, and then let's maybe move to questions and answers. Thank you very much, David. So we have some questions here in the Q&A box. I'm delighted to say we've got a good bit of activity going on there. So let's start.
I just add one thing before you start on that, Gordon.
Sure,
so,
go on.
Which I didn't make clear in 27701. 27001, you achieve that first for your security controls. If you then want an extension, you get 27701 on top of that. So you have to have 27001 first, and then you get 701 as an extension to that.
Right, that's so 27001 is the foundation for all of that.
That's
fantastic.
Exactly.
Thanks for clarifying. And in fact, our first question relates to that. I won't name the people who've given the Q&As, but they should probably recognize their questions in there. This attendee says, I've purchased both 27001 and 27701. I appreciate 27701 is an extension to 27001. When reading 27701 in broad terms, it suggests to substitute information security with information security and privacy. I think this is quite unwieldy, and a combined standard would be more customer friendly, especially for a startup where both InfoSec and data protection would likely to be progressed as a single effort. Is there any combined document out there?
Not from the standard specific, because the standards, remember, it started out with 27001 for information security, and privacy is an addition to that, it's an extension. But from your perspective, from your company's perspective, you can write your policy any way you want. So you can write a policy that covers security and privacy. That's how I would address that with your particular context. I don't know the company, don't know the organization, but if you can, there are separate requirements for privacy and for security, and they are actually two different things. But in your company, I quite often, let me give you an example, a tangible example. I quite often work with companies and recommend that they have one policy and set of procedures for incident response and data breach response. So a data breach being, I have to tell the regulator, okay? Not every security incident is a data breach. Almost every data breach is a security incident. But if you combine the two, it's very clear that as soon as you know, if there's a data breach, you know something's happened, you know something's gone wrong. As soon as you know it has any a chance of there being personally identifiable information, people data involved, then you kick into the data breach side, and you involve your DPO or your data protection person to advise, and then the clock's ticking, because then you've got that regulated reporting side of the house to look after as well, instead of just being a security incident. That one takes precedent. So you can actually adapt that to suit your organization and develop one policy that covers both standards, if that helps.
Yeah, and just it occurs to me, a follow-up question there might be that, maybe some of our audience might have the impression that ISO 27001 is exclusively for large organizations, but as our first question just addressed, they spoke about it in terms of a startup. How big or small a company or an organization do you need to be in order to go after certification to ISO 27001?
It's very tailorable for any size organization. We probably one of the most challenging organizations we had, great little company, was a sole trader. But it's very hard to do segregation of duties for a sole trader because there's one person, that's that one person in the company. So what we managed to do with them is develop a policy that works for them. It applies to all the controls, and through your statement of applicability, you decide which ones don't apply. But what we actually gave them is a policy with some bits grayed out to future-proof them. So as soon as that company starts recruiting and gets 2, 3, 4 or more people, they've got a section to shoe in around segregation of duties. And do you know what? They know at the outset what's required of them. So it works today, and also they're future-proofed for as the company grows as well. So that's what we're trying to build in, that longer-term resilience as well, so that we want all of our companies to grow and expand and be successful. So we build that into your policies for you wherever possible. So any size organization, we've got quite a few of them that are, 2, 3, 4. reasonably small companies. I mean, it's only 4 years ago, BH Consulting only had less than a handful of employees, and we're growing ourselves. So we have to make our policies adapt as well as we grow as a company too.
That's right. Well, that leads on. I'm going to jump to one of the other questions here, which is both related to the size of company and also the timeline, the time involved in achieving certification. And this questioner asks, can you talk a little bit about timeline? Typically, how long does it take, not from a standing start, for a circa 15-person company to get certified? Okay. Now, in this case, they've said IT company, but let's just sure. Broaden that out.
So I wish I could copyright or patent the answer to every security question, which is it depends. Right? What's your name? It depends. Depends who's asking. Who wants to know? A good guide, we'd normally say 6 to 9 months project. Now, there are a lot of dependencies in that. If you already have your policies and they're well established and they're of good enough quality, just throw that one in there as well. But if you've got established policies, you can do it in less time than that. We've got companies who, from a standing start, are trying to do it in less than 6 months. There is a risk that comes with that, because you might be trying to do it too quickly and you might have more gaps that way, or you might not have time to establish those policies. We usually give that as a guide, but as I said, it really does depend if you're where your starting point is, because if you're already, I'd still recommend you do the gap analysis, but the gap analysis, if that doesn't show many gaps or nothing tangible, nothing really big that you can't fix, you can certainly do it in less time than that. As I said, the stage 1, stage 2 process by the external audit, they usually give at least 2 months between them so that they've got time to process and make sure that anything they call out is fixed. But, you know, there's no, if your policies are good, you do the gap analysis and it all looks good, and you have that risk process in place, then you could potentially do it in less than that. But we usually say the guide, you know, around 6 months plus would be what I'd say. Could be less if you want the challenge, you know.
Fair enough. And just for clarity as well, to pick up on one of the questions here in the Q&A box as well, as part of the certification, do we not have to conduct supervision audits by the auditing body through the lifetime of the certification? So can we just get some clarity around what's the role of each individual actor, if you like, in the certification process?
Absolutely. So, and that's a great question. Thanks for picking up on that, whoever asked that. So I mentioned it's a long-term commitment. It is. You tend to get certified on a 3-year basis, okay? And as part of that commitment, you have to have at least annual internal audits, which you can either do yourself or get somebody else, like ourselves, to come and do that for you. The external accreditation body will conduct a 6-monthly surveillance over the period of those 3 years. So every 6 months, they'll come and audit. And what they do during that audit, they select some of the controls out of clauses 4 to 10, the management bit, and some of the controls out of the annex. And what that gives them to do, because they're not doing the full audit, they will still take, depending on the size of the organization, a day or two to conduct those audits over, but they deep dive a bit more. They scratch a bit more under the surface to see that you're actually applying the controls properly, that you're not just access controls, yes, you've got a procedure. This is actually saying, are you actually doing them? Are people actually following the process as you've written it? And are there any gaps in those processes? So those 6 monthly audits are a requirement. So you're paying for those. You are, you know, that's part of the commitment. What some of our clients do is we conduct 6 monthly internal audits for them. So we would follow the same pattern, we would cover the same management controls, clauses 4 to 10, and the annexes, so that you've got an internal audit run of the audit controls that are going to be checked by the external auditor. So there's no surprises when it comes to the external one. Okay, you're fully prepared. Does that help? Okay. Answer your question?
It does, and in fact that leads on nicely to another of the questions, which is just around whether BH Consulting does both the stage 1 and stage 2 audit, or is it an external ISO 27001 auditor that has to get involved at that point?
We can help you with internal audits. We can help you with all the stages leading up to audit. We don't conduct the stage 1 or stage 2s. That's an external body that does that for you. we'd recommend that there's a few companies operating in Ireland. Some of them are very, very good. We stop short of recommending them because we're technology and company agnostic, but we can certainly give you some ideas of ones to call, or we can point you to where to find the information of which ones would be applicable to you appropriately. We'd recommend you get a couple of quotes because although there is a standard that they follow, the accreditation bodies themselves follow, there's a commercial element to that as well. So you do get different prices depending on who's auditing, who that accreditation body is.
Okay, and actually that's brings us nicely to another question from our Q&A section about cost. The questioner is asking, what is the cost to get compliant? And we've already covered how long it takes, but they're saying what, about how long the process takes. You've said 6 to 9 months, but they've also, what costs are charged by ISO, if any?
Amy, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah. So just, again, unfortunately, it just depends on the size of the company, the complexity of the company, and there's a lot of factors. So we would need to get more information from you before we would give you in and around cost. So if you are interested, just to either contact your account manager or your sales at BH Consulting. But there is additional costs when it comes to actually certifying as well, which again depends. So I don't know if you want to.
I would just add from an ISO perspective, the certification part comes from your accredited body. They cover that. That's included in their costs. The only additional cost really on top of that would be buying the document itself. So the ISO 27001 document, and again, we can give you a steer on which one to buy. There's a few different variations out there. 27001, 2013 is the latest version. It has had some iterations since then that have been retrospectively applied. So there are some that will tell you it's 27001, 2017. All of the things that were applied to them were applied retrospectively. So 27001, 2013 is actually the latest version. There is another version being developed, and it's taken some time to do it. They do take a long time to process these things. It was expected out this year. We're now looking at really the end of 2022, maybe even 2023 before we see the next version of it coming out. The document itself, the 27001 document as a PDF, as a download, costs, it's the ISO web. You can buy from a couple of different places, but you buy it directly from the ISO website as a download. It's something like 118 Swiss francs, which is around 108 euros. The 27002, which is the code, the code which will help you comply with all the annexes, all the requirements of the Annex A, I should say. That's around a little bit more expensive, around 180 Swiss francs, I think it is, about 160, 170 quid. Good to get if you're going to do all that on your own. Certainly the 27001, it's good to demonstrate to the auditor that you read it, you're aware of it, you know what the requirements are. But they're in the context of business, they're reasonably small costs. But they're good reading for the insomniacs if you want to plow through them as well. So
good stuff. And just there's a final comment here which just relates to the question I had earlier on in the webinar about whether auditors go off script. And our contributor has said the auditors audit against 27001, not just the Annex and 27002 controls. For example, governance, ownership, metrics, risk committees, and so on aren't included in the Annex or 27002.
Correct. The governance and the management piece is covered in 27003. But we can help you with that certainly on what the requirements are, what they would be expected, what you'd be expected to provide as evidence for those. There's a standard for everything.
Well, in the short time that we've left, David, maybe we might just loop back, because we did call this event, that we gave it the subtitle of Build Trust in Your Business. So if we look at the benefits of getting certified, the advantages of doing so, I mean, compliance can get a bad rap at times, but as you've alluded to several times throughout your presentation, this is really about documenting processes, doing things in a documented, repeatable way, having evidence that you do things in the right way. So that obviously all plays into carrying out your business, your operations in a very systematic and repeatable way. Can you talk a little bit, just in the time that we have left, about the benefits of getting certified to ISO 27001 and how that helps to build that confidence and trust that other stakeholders can have in your organization?
Sure, so I'll talk that through in the context of why some of you may be here. As I suggested before, I think GDPR has driven this to look down that supply chain. If a lot of you might be getting these questionnaires from your clients saying, tell us about your security position, and they send you these, some of them are huge, these spreadsheets, questionnaires. If you're applying, if you have, and they're all asking, do you have these policies? Do you do these things? You're looking at your supply chain, they're looking at their supply chain. How are you looking after my data, my business, my information? So having a policy, as I said, sets out, then they're not always the greatest read, but they set out the company expectations. Here's how we're going to organize and structure our data. Here's how we're going to process it. This is what we expect of our employees. So that's your policies. And as well as telling the employees what they expect, they're great to give to your clients. If you are one of those clients with one of those third-party questionnaires, these are the policies we're applying to look after your data. If you get the certification, you might not need to show them that policy because it's already been externally audited. You have that external audit, that accreditation process. And that's where you might save a little bit of time. They might still want the detail behind it. They might still want the questionnaire filled in. But if you've got certification, you've already answered a lot of those questions because you've answered them to an auditor.
And it's documented in the evidence, as you said.
Yeah. So you've provided policies, you've provided supporting evidence to show that you're doing what you said you were going to do. And that will satisfy your client, your customer, that you are applying good security controls. Some of them will scratch under the surface and see whether those controls meet their requirements. But sometimes having that certification is, they're happy enough. And certainly as you grow as a company, you should be looking at your third parties and seeing what controls they have.
Yeah.
So I often admit that if you're going to drop the kid, you've got a newborn and you want to drop it off in a creche, do you just go to the nearest creche and say, oh, here you are, here's my precious bundle of joy, I'll pick them up at six, you would tend to have a bit of a look and see what security, what protection they have, and whether they background check their staff. You're doing the same with your data, your information. So it certainly feeds into that supply chain about having that standard process to show your clients, your customers, that you're doing the right things here. We know what's required to protect our data. We have the right controls in place.
Yeah, and of course, this isn't a self-certified badge, as you've said. This is independently audited, and that's also what gives it its credibility and its weight.
That it's the independent checking that comes into play that actually gives it the stamp of approval, if you like. That's what the value is about. But the fact you've even read the standard, you've aligned to it, puts you in a good space because you've followed a good structure, you've followed a good framework. Because you can align to the standard without actually sitting the exam, without actually going through the certification, and that's a good start. But that additional certification demonstrates to your customers that you've gone that stage further and you've got that continuous assessment as part of your process. Okay,
thanks very much, David. All right, well, here we are practically at the top of the hour. So I'd just like to say, first of all, thank you very much to David for your time and knowledge and expertise and sharing with us all today. Thank you to everybody who has attended. Just to wrap up some key points, as David mentioned, one of the great things about ISO 27001 is that it's independent and external. So anybody can look at this internationally. It's demonstrating that you have good security controls in place. And you can choose to a good extent whether you certify a particular process, a particular site, or the entire company. And as David has just mentioned, it can save you some time and resources if you're, for example, going after tenders where a potential customer is requiring that of you. Now, and as well, it should help you improve your business anyway, because you'll go through some process improvements. So it's suitable for businesses of any size. And it's one thing to remember is it's not just once and done, it's an ongoing commitment to continuous improvement. But again, that's something that has business benefits above and beyond just security, but just for how you run your business day to day. So on behalf of BH Consulting, thank you all very much for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.